Imagine, if you will, waking not to the gentle persuasion of sunlight or the chirping of birds, but to a dull, persistent ache deep within your belly. This is not the sharp pang of having skipped a single meal. This is a familiar sensation, a constant companion that has been with you for as long as you can remember. This is the gnawing void, the baseline of your existence as a peasant in the Middle Ages. It is the first thing you feel in the cold, damp air of your one-room hut, even before your eyes fully open to the dim light filtering through a small, unglazed window or the cracks in the wattle and daub walls. This hunger isn't always a screaming agony, not yet. More often, it is a low, simmering emptiness, a hollowness that dictates the rhythm of your days and colours every perception. You rise from your straw pallet, the rough fibres scratching against your skin, and the first thought that solidifies in your mind, even before greeting your family, is food, or rather, the perpetual lack of it. Your movements are deliberate, a conservation of precious energy. Every calorie is a treasure, not to be squandered. As you prepare for the day's back-breaking labour in the fields, the air in your small dwelling is thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and perhaps, if you are fortunate, the faint aroma of something meagre being heated over the central hearth. This might be a thin pottage, a watery gruel made from oats or barley, perhaps with a few foraged greens thrown in if the season allows, and you had the energy the previous evening to search for them. There is no joyous anticipation of a hearty breakfast to fuel your toil. There is only the resigned acceptance of what little is available. You eat, slowly, methodically. The texture is coarse, the taste bland. Salt is a luxury. Spice is an unimaginable dream reserved for the lord of the manor or wealthy merchants in distant towns. Your daily bread, if you have it, is not the soft white loaf of a nobleman's table. It is dark, heavy, made from rye or barley, often with added fillers like bean flour, pea flour, or even, in truly desperate times, ground acorns or bark to make the precious grain stretch further. Each bite is dense, requiring significant effort to chew and swallow, yet it offers little in the way of true satisfaction, only a temporary filling of that persistent void. Throughout the long hours you spend bent over in the Lord's fields, or tending your own small precarious strip of land, the hunger hums beneath the surface of your consciousness. It is there as you guide the heavy, unwieldy plough, its wooden share barely scratching the surface of the often unyielding soil. It is there as you swing the scythe, your back screaming in protest, your muscles burning. It is there as you weed, your fingers raw and caked with dirt. Every drop of sweat that stings your eyes feels like a draining of your already insufficient reserves. You see your fellow peasants, their faces etched with the same weariness, their bodies often gaunt beneath their rough woolen tunics. Children, their bellies sometimes distended not from fullness, but from the cruel trickery of malnutrition, play with a lethargy that belies their youth. You watch the Lord's reeve, well-fed and ruddy-cheeked, as he oversees your work, his very presence a stark reminder of the vast chasm that separates his world from yours. His complaints about your pace, your supposed idleness, feel like a particularly bitter irony when your limbs feel like lead and your head swims from lack of sustenance. Even in seasons of relative plenty, after a successful harvest, the amount of food available to you and your family is barely enough. True satiation, the feeling of a comfortably full stomach and a mind free from the worry of the next meal, is a rare and fleeting sensation. The concept of eating for pleasure is alien. Food is fuel, and often there is simply not enough fuel to keep the engine of your body running smoothly. This chronic undernourishment isn't just a physical burden, it's a mental one. The constant, low-grade hunger dulls your thoughts, shortens your temper, and clouds your ability to hope for much beyond surviving another day, another week. Joy is muted. Laughter infrequent. Your world shrinks, focusing on the immediate and the essential. The weather, the state of the crops, the signs of illness in your livestock, if you are lucky enough to own any. You learn to read the subtle signs of nature with an acuity born of desperation. Which berries are safe? Which roots can be boiled into something vaguely edible, where the scrawniest fish might be caught in the local stream, if the Lord permits it? Your knowledge is a legacy of survival, passed down through generations who have walked this same tightrope of near starvation. And as the sun finally dips below the horizon, painting the sky in colours you barely have the energy to appreciate, you trudge back to your hut. The evening meal is often a repeat of the morning's fare, perhaps with the addition of a few boiled vegetables from your small garden plot, if it hasn't been raided or decimated by pests or harsh weather. There is no lingering over the table, no convivial conversation that extends late into the night. There is only the brief respite of consuming what little you have, and then the pull of exhaustion, a sleep that is less about true rest, and more about a temporary escape from the gnawing void that will inevitably greet you again at dawn. This is your life, lived on the precipice, where true hunger is not an event, but the very fabric of your days, an unseen companion shadowing your every step. The gnawing void in your stomach, that constant unwelcome guest, has only one true enemy, the harvest. Your entire existence, and that of your family, hinges precariously on the success or failure of the crops you painstakingly cultivate. Yet, this crucial harvest is not a reliable bounty. It is a fragile, unpredictable entity, held captive by the tyrannical whims of nature and the limitations of your own meagre resources. You live under the oppressive shadow of forces far beyond your control, each one capable of dashing your hopes for sustenance and plunging you deeper into the abyss of hunger. First, there is the weather, an arbitrary and often cruel overlord. You scan the skies daily, hourly, searching for portents, your heart aflutter with a mixture of hope and dread. Too much rain, and your newly sown fields transform into a sodden morass. The precious seeds rot in the ground before they can sprout, or the young seedlings, struggling for air, become waterlogged and yellowed, succumbing to fungal blights like rust or ergot that can turn a promising crop into a field of poison or ruin. You watch helplessly as the relentless downpour turns pathways into quagmires, making it impossible to even reach your small plots, let alone tend them. The smell of decay, of damp earth and dying plants, fills the air, a sickening perfume of impending starvation. Conversely, the absence of rain is just as devastating. Weeks can stretch into months under a brassy, unyielding sky. The sun, once a life-giver, becomes a tormentor, baking the earth into a cracked, dusty wasteland. Your carefully tended plants, which you watered with back-breaking effort, carrying heavy wooden buckets from the nearest stream, or, well, begin to wilt. Their leaves curl inwards, turning a sickly brown, then a brittle yellow. The soil, once soft and yielding, becomes as hard as stone, resisting your hoe, mocking your efforts. The streams you rely on dwindle to trickles, then disappear altogether, leaving behind a parched, muddy scar. Your own throat feels constantly dry, and the thought of your livestock, if you are fortunate enough to possess any, suffering the same thirst adds another layer to your anxiety. You see your future shrivelling alongside the dying crops. Then there are the sudden, savage assaults of unseasonal weather. A late spring frost, arriving with treacherous stealth after the first tender shoots have emerged, can blacken an entire field overnight, wiping out weeks of labour in a few cruel hours. An early autumn freeze can catch the grain before it has fully ripened, rendering it immature and less nutritious, or worse, completely inedible. Hailstorms, great frozen pellets driven by violent winds, can descend with shocking ferocity, shredding leaves, snapping stalks, and flattening entire swathes of nearly mature crops in a matter of minutes, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. You can only cower in your hut, listening to the roar and clatter, praying for it to end, knowing that each crashing impact on your roof is echoed by destruction in the fields that represent your survival. Beyond the caprice of the heavens lies the earth itself, often an unforgiving and reluctant partner in your struggle for sustenance. The land you work, allocated by the lord of the manor, is frequently not the most fertile. The best lands are often reserved for the lord's own demesne, or perhaps for more favoured tenants. You might find yourself toiling on thin, stony soil or on heavy clay that is difficult to drain and even harder to work. Generations of continuous farming, with limited knowledge of effective crop rotation or soil replenishment, have often left the land exhausted, its life-giving nutrients depleted. The animal manure that could enrich it is a precious commodity. Your scrawny livestock produce little, and what they do produce is often dried and used as fuel, especially in areas where firewood is scarce. So, you break your back trying to coax a meagre yield from tired earth, and the tools you wield in this constant battle? They are a testament to your back-breaking labour rather than a means of easing it. Your plough, if you have access to one beyond a simple hand hoe, is likely a heavy, cumbersome wooden ard. It might possess a small iron tip if you are fortunate, but it primarily just scratches a shallow furrow in the soil rather than truly turning it over to bring fresh nutrients to the surface and bury weeds. This means you must make multiple passes over the same strip of land, often guiding the unwieldy implement yourself, or with the aid of a single, equally malnourished ox or donkey, if such a beast is available to your family or village collective. The strain on your body, and on any animal you employ, is immense. When it comes time to reap what you have sown, assuming weather and soil have been even moderately kind, you face the harvest with a sickle or a scythe. Both demand hours of stooping and swinging, your muscles screaming in protest, your hands becoming calloused and blistered. The scythe, though faster than the sickle for grains, is still a hand tool requiring strength and endurance you may not possess after months of poor nutrition. This slow, laborious process means your crops remain exposed to the elements, a sudden downpour, a flock of hungry birds, for longer than they might with more efficient methods. Once cut, the grain must be threshed to separate the edible kernels from the stalks and husks. This is typically done with a flail, 2 pieces of wood joined by a leather thong. You stand for hours, rhythmically beating the harvested grain on a hard-packed earthen floor, the dust filling your lungs, the repetitive impact jarring your arms and shoulders. It is exhausting, inefficient work. Then comes winnowing, tossing the threshed grain into the air, relying on the wind to carry away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier grain to fall back onto a sheet. If there is no wind, you wait, the precious grain vulnerable to spoilage or pests. Pests themselves, from rats and mice in your meagre storage, to weevils in the grain, to locusts or caterpillars in the fields, are a constant threat, met with little more than prayer, manual removal if possible, or despair. Every grain lost to them is a grain stolen from your family's mouths. Thus, your entire year revolves around this gamble. You are trapped in a cycle where unpredictable weather, unyielding soil, and primitive, labour-intensive tools conspire against you. There is no margin for error, no safety net. A single hailstorm, a prolonged drought, a blight that sweeps through the fields, any of these can mean the difference between bare subsistence and outright starvation. The success of the harvest is not a celebration of abundance, but a temporary reprieve from the ever-present threat of the gnawing void, a fragile shield that all too often shatters. Even if, by some miracle of benevolent weather and your own relentless toil, you manage to coax a respectable yield from your meagre plot of land, the relief is fleeting. Before a single grain can pass the lips of your hungry children, or be set aside for the harsh winter months ahead, other hands, powerful and unyielding, reach out to claim their due. The fragile harvest, won at such tremendous personal cost, is not truly yours. You are but a tenant on land owned by another, a soul bound by a web of obligations that seem designed to keep you perpetually on the edge of destitution. The Lord of the Manor and the Church, institutions that loom large over your existence, demand their share, and these demands often feel like a slow, systematic bleeding of your family's lifeblood. First, there is the Lord. Your right to cultivate your small strips of land in the village's open fields comes at a steep price. A significant portion of your harvest, often a fixed amount or a percentage, regardless of how poor your yield might be that year, is owed directly to him. This is the shampart, or a similar feudal due, the rent for the very earth you sweat and bleed upon. Come harvest time, the Lord's reeve or bailiff, his stern face, a mask of authority, will be there, watching, measuring, ensuring the master receives his full entitlement. You watch with a sinking heart as bushels of your hard-won wheat, barley, or rye are carted away to the Lord's granary, a towering stone structure that seems to mock your own flimsy storage hut. There is no negotiation, no appeal to lean years or personal hardship. The Lord's share is sacrosanct. Failure to deliver could mean fines, eviction, or even physical punishment. Beyond the direct claim on your crops, your labour is also owed. Several days a week, often 3 or more, you are required to work on the Lord's domain, his personal land holdings, typically the most fertile and best maintained in the manor. This is corvée labour. During these days, you are not tending your own survival. You are toiling for his enrichment. Ploughing his fields, sowing his seeds, weeding his crops, and, most crucially, harvesting his grain, which will often be far more abundant than your own. This labour is unpaid, an obligation tied to your tenancy. These are days lost to your own family's needs, days when your own small harvest might be ripening under the sun, needing attention, or when you could be foraging or mending your dilapidated hut. The exhaustion from working the Lord's land then eats into your ability to effectively manage your own. Then there are the myriad of other feudal dues and payments. You might have to pay a fee to use the Lord's mill to grind your grain into flour, a monopoly you cannot escape, as private handmills are often forbidden. The miller, himself a figure of some power and often resentment, will take a portion of your grain as his payment. The mulcher, sometimes perceived as being scooped with a suspiciously generous hand. You might owe a fee to bake your bread in the Lord's communal oven. The banalité, another obligation enforced to prevent you from constructing your own. If you own a few scrawny chickens or a pig, you may owe a portion of these to the Lord. A fee for allowing your pigs to forage for acorns in the Lord's woods, pannage. A fee when your daughter marries, merchet. A fee when you inherit your father's tenancy, heriot. Often the best beast you own. The list can feel endless, each small payment a further drain on your already scarce resources. These are not mere taxes, they are the fundamental structure of your dependency. And then there is the church, an equally powerful institution. It too demands its share. The tithe, meaning a tenth, is owed on all your agricultural produce, your livestock, and even sometimes on other earnings. You are expected to give 1/10 of your grain, 1/10 of your wool, 1/10 of your newborn lambs or calves to support the local priest and the wider church. Like the Lord's dues, the tithe is often collected rigorously. The priest or his appointed collector will come to your fields, to your small barn if you have one, to assess and claim what is deemed God's portion. While the spiritual purpose might be emphasized, for you, in the face of gnawing hunger, it feels like another portion of your family's survival being siphoned away. In years of bad harvest, when your yield is already dangerously low, losing another 10% can be a devastating blow, pushing you closer to the brink. Imagine the scene. Your grain is threshed, a precious mound that represents months of back-breaking work and anxious hope. Before you can even calculate how long it might last your family, the Lord's reeve arrives, his sacks ready. A significant portion disappears. Then comes the church's representative, and another portion is taken. What remains, after these primary obligations are met, is what you have to live on. It's often a shockingly small amount, barely enough to see you through to the next uncertain harvest, let alone to build any kind of reserve against unforeseen disasters. The psychological weight of these obligations is immense. You work, you struggle, you endure, but a substantial part of your effort directly benefits others, those whose lives are conspicuously more comfortable than your own. There's a deep-seated unfairness to it, a feeling of being trapped in a system where your hard labour primarily serves to maintain the wealth and power of those above you. Any complaint, any hint of resistance is met with the full force of manorial law or ecclesiastical authority. You are caught in a vice, squeezed from both sides. This constant extraction of resources means you can never get ahead. There is no surplus to invest in better tools, no extra seed to expand your planting if opportunity arose, no chance to save for a truly rainy day. You live perpetually on the edge, every calorie accounted for, every obligation a source of anxiety. The Lord's share and the Church's tithe are not just economic transactions, they are heavy chains, binding you to a life of scarcity, ensuring that even in the best of years, the spectre of hunger is never truly banished, only held temporarily at bay by the slivers of the harvest you are permitted to keep. When the meagre portion of the harvest you are permitted to keep dwindles, as it so often does long before the next one is due, and the last of the dried peas or stored grain turns to dust at the bottom of the pot, you enter a terrifying new phase of the struggle for survival. This is when the distinction between what is considered food and what is merely edible matter blurs into a desperate, grey ambiguity. You are forced to turn to what historians grimly refer to as famine foods, the wild, often unpalatable, and sometimes dangerous substances that the earth offers up to those with no other choice. This is not a quaint pastoral scene of gathering berries. This is a brutal daily scrabble for anything that might quell the relentless ache in your belly and sustain life for a little longer. Your days become consumed by foraging. You, your spouse, even your young children, if they are old enough to walk and possess a sliver of understanding, will spend hours scouring the hedgerows, the edges of woodlands, if you are permitted access by the Lord, and the fallow fields. Your eyes, sharpened by hunger, search for any sign of sustenance. You dig in the hard, often frozen ground with your bare hands or a pointed stick for A. N. Y. roots or tubers that might have been overlooked by others equally desperate. You might find wild carrots, tough and stringy, or parsnips, small and bitter compared to their cultivated cousins. You gather dandelions, their leaves and roots, sorrel, nettles, which must be carefully handled and boiled to remove their sting, but offer some meagre nutrients, and various other wild greens that in better times would be considered mere weeds, fit only for livestock, acorns, which in times of plenty your pigs might fatten on, become a crucial, if laborious, part of your diet. You gather them by the sackful, if you can find an oak tree not strictly reserved by the Lord. But acorns are not immediately edible. They are bitter with tannins and must be leached, a time-consuming process of repeatedly boiling them or soaking them in running water to make them palatable, or at least less likely to cause severe stomach upset. Even then, the resulting flour or mash is coarse, unappetizing, and provides minimal real nourishment. You chew them slowly, the rough texture scraping your throat. When the ground offers little, your gaze turns upwards, to the trees themselves. You learn to strip the bark from certain trees, birch, elm, or pine, depending on what grows in your region. Not the tough outer bark, but the softer inner cambium layer. This is then dried, pounded, and ground into a makeshift flour, often mixed with a tiny precious handful of actual grain flour, if any remains, or with ground acorns or dried peas, to extend the volume. Bread made with such bark flour is heavy, resinous, and can taste of turpentine or a bitter earthiness. It provides bulk, a fleeting sensation of fullness, but offers little in the way of true energy, and can often lead to digestive problems, constipation, or agonizing cramps. Yet, it is something. It is a barrier, however flimsy, against outright starvation. In the most desperate straits, when even bark and roots are scarce due to competition or the depletion of resources, you might resort to even more grim fare. There are accounts of people eating grass, boiled and reboiled, to make it somewhat digestible, though it often passes through the system with little benefit, sometimes causing more distress than relief. You might try to eat ferns, or even straw, chopped and boiled, hoping to extract some residual nutrient, some semblance of sustenance. Mosses and lichens, scraped from rocks or trees, might be added to the ever-present watery pottage. The waterways, if accessible and not strictly poached for the Lord, offer a slim chance. You might try to catch small, bony fish with crude nets or lines. Frogs, snails, and even insects like grubs or beetles, if you can overcome the innate revulsion, become potential sources of protein. Your children, their small hands adept at such tasks, might be sent to collect these meagre additions to the family pot. Every creature, no matter how small or unappetizing, is assessed for its potential to fill the void. This constant search for famine foods is exhausting and demoralizing. It consumes vast amounts of time and energy that you can ill afford, for often very little return. Each foray into the woods or fields is a gamble, with no guarantee of success. The competition for these scant resources can be fierce. You might find areas already picked clean by other starving families. The threat of punishment for foraging on the Lord's restricted lands adds another layer of fear to your desperation. Moreover, knowledge is crucial, and misinformation can be deadly. You rely on ancestral wisdom, passed down through hushed voices, about which plants are safe and which are poisonous. But in times of extreme hunger, people might take risks, or misidentify a plant, leading to sickness or even death. Children are particularly vulnerable, their immature bodies less able to cope with the toxins in certain wild plants or the indigestible nature of some famine foods. You watch them anxiously after every strange new addition to your diet, praying it will nourish rather than harm. The taste of these famine foods is a constant reminder of your poverty, your desperation. There is no pleasure in eating them, only a grim determination to survive. The woody texture of bark bread, the bitterness of unseasoned roots, the sliminess of boiled nettles, these become the flavours of your daily existence. Your palate, already unaccustomed to luxury, becomes further deadened to anything but the most basic sensations of hunger and its temporary unsatisfying appeasement. The search for and consumption of these foods is a brutal testament to the human will to live, but also a stark indicator of just how far removed your life is from any semblance of comfort or security. It is a world where eating tree bark is not an aberration, but a grim necessity in the relentless battle against the encroaching void. The persistent, gnawing hunger and the forced reliance on famine foods are not merely uncomfortable. They are insidious forces that wage a slow, relentless war on your physical being. Chronic malnutrition is not a swift killer like the plague or a battlefield wound. Instead, it is a wasting disease, a creeping erosion of your strength, your resilience, and even your appearance, leaving you and your family increasingly vulnerable to every other hardship life throws your way. You witness its devastating effects in your own reflection, if you ever catch a glimpse in a murky puddle, and more painfully in the fading vitality of your loved ones. In the earliest stages, it might manifest as a persistent lethargy, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest can dispel. Your limbs feel heavy, your movements sluggish. The work in the fields, already arduous, becomes an almost insurmountable task. Your mind, too, feels dulled, concentration difficult, and small tasks requiring mental effort seem overwhelming. This is not laziness, as the Lord's Reeve might accuse. It is your body, starved of essential nutrients like iron and B vitamins, beginning to shut down non-essential functions to conserve what little energy it has. As the weeks and months of inadequate food stretch on, more visible signs appear. Your skin, normally weathered by sun and wind, becomes dry, flaky, and strangely pale or sallow. Small sores or rashes might erupt and refuse to heal, easily becoming infected in the unsanitary conditions of your daily life. Your hair, once perhaps thick, becomes dull, brittle, and may begin to fall out in patches. Your eyes, lacking vitamin A, might become dry, itchy, and increasingly sensitive to light, leading to night blindness, making it even harder to navigate your dim hut or undertake any tasks after dusk. You might notice your gums becoming soft, spongy, and prone to bleeding. The telltale signs of scurvy, as fresh fruits and vegetables rich in vitamin C are seasonal luxuries you rarely enjoy consistently, especially during the long, lean winter months. Your teeth, already likely worn from a coarse diet, may loosen and eventually fall out. Your muscles, starved of protein, begin to waste away. The satisfying roundness of a well-nourished limb disappears, replaced by a gaunt, skeletal appearance. Your ribs become more prominent, your collarbones sharp beneath your thinning skin. Any stored fat your body once had is long gone, consumed by its desperate need for fuel. This loss of muscle mass further diminishes your strength, making you less capable of the physical labour upon which your survival depends, creating a vicious cycle. Less food leads to less strength, which leads to less ability to procure food. For children, the effects of chronic malnutrition are particularly devastating and can leave lifelong scars if they survive at all. Growth becomes stunted. A child who should be reaching new heights remains small, their limbs thin, their development lagging far behind that of a well-fed child of the same age. Their bellies might swell, a condition known as kwashiorkor, not from fullness, but from oedema caused by protein deficiency, a grotesque mockery of satiation. Rickets, caused by a lack of vitamin D and calcium, might lead to softened, bowing leg bones, leaving a child permanently deformed. Their immune systems, critically underdeveloped due to lack of vital nutrients, are pathetically weak. They become incredibly susceptible to common childhood illnesses, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, even a simple cold or a bout of diarrhea, which a healthier child might fight off, but for them can prove fatal. The mournful wail of a grieving mother is an all too common sound in your village. Edema, or swelling, isn't confined to children. As your own body's protein levels plummet, fluids can accumulate in your tissues, leading to puffy ankles, swollen legs, and even a bloated face, masking the true extent of your emaciation beneath a deceptive softness. This is hunger bloat, a cruel paradox where your body appears larger even as it is starving from within. You feel heavy and sluggish, yet profoundly weak. Your body's ability to fight off any infection is severely compromised. A minor cut or scrape, which might have healed quickly in better times, can fester, turning into a dangerous, spreading ulcer. The constant exposure to cold and damp in your poorly built hut, combined with your weakened state, makes you an easy target for respiratory infections like pneumonia or bronchitis. Tuberculosis, the wasting disease in its own right, thrives in malnourished populations living in close, unsanitary quarters. The cough that starts as a minor irritation can deepen, becoming racking and bloody, a death sentence you have no power to fight. Even your mental state is affected by the physical decay. Apathy and depression often accompany severe malnutrition. The world can seem grey and hopeless. Irritability flares easily, and despair becomes a constant shadow. There's a particular cruelty to this, as the very will to survive can be eroded by the physical depletion your body is undergoing. You look at your family, at your neighbours, and you see these signs mirrored. The slow, creeping disfigurement is a shared experience. There is no escape, no special remedy, only the desperate hope that the next harvest will be better, or that some small windfall might bring temporary relief. The wasting disease of malnutrition is a silent killer, working from the inside out, turning vibrant human beings into hollow shells, testaments to the brutal reality of a life lived perpetually on the brink of starvation. It's not just the absence of food, but the profound systemic damage that its long-term lack inflicts upon your very being, a slow, painful deterioration witnessed day by weary day. In your world, as a medieval peasant, the line between meagre subsistence and outright catastrophe is terrifyingly thin. You live without a safety net, without reserves, without the cushion of accumulated wealth or stored surplus that protects those higher up the social ladder. Your entire existence is a precarious balancing act, and the fulcrum upon which it all rests is the annual harvest. Because you have no margin for error, a single failed harvest is not merely a setback or a period of increased hardship. It is an unmitigated disaster, a trigger that can unleash a cascade of horrors, pushing your family and your entire community into the jaws of famine and despair. Imagine the preceding months, the back-breaking labour of ploughing, sowing, weeding, all fueled by the dwindling remnants of last year's already insufficient stores. Hope, fragile as it is pinned on the ripening crops in the fields. You watch them with an almost religious fervour, scrutinising every change in colour, every new shoot, every threat from pests or disease. This harvest is not about getting rich, it's about survival. It's about having enough coarse bread to see you through the winter, enough seed to plant for the following year, and perhaps, just perhaps, a tiny bit extra to trade for a pair of worn shoes or a sliver of salt. Then disaster strikes. It could be a prolonged drought that withers the stalks before the grain heads can fill. It could be a week of torrential, unceasing rain just as the crops are ready for reaping, causing the grain to rot on the stalk or sprout in the ear, rendering it useless. It could be a sudden, devastating hailstorm that flattens entire fields in minutes, or an infestation of locusts that descends like a biblical plague, consuming everything in its path. Perhaps it's a cattle murrain that wipes out the oxen needed for ploughing, making next year's planting an impossibility even if you had seed. Or a blight, like the dreaded ergot, which not only destroys the rye but can poison those who unknowingly consume it, leading to agonizing convulsions, gangrene, and madness. The moment you realize the harvest has failed, a chilling dread unlike any other sets in. It's a cold, hard certainty that the months ahead will be a desperate struggle for survival, far worse than the usual privations. The small amount of grain you might have managed to salvage, if any, will be utterly insufficient. The Lord's share and the Church's tithe will still be expected, often calculated on an anticipated normal yield, further deepening your deficit before you've even begun. You look at your hungry children, at the worried face of your spouse, and the weight of responsibility feels crushing. With no significant stores to fall back on, the consequences of a failed harvest are immediate and brutal. The meagre supplies in your hut dwindle with terrifying speed. The descent into reliance on famine foods, roots, bark, boiled grass, begins much earlier in the year and becomes far more intense. The competition for these scant wild resources becomes savage, as every family in the village faces the same desperate plight. The woods and hedgerows are stripped bare with alarming quickness. The price of any available grain in local markets, if there are any, and if you have anything at all to trade, skyrockets. Merchants and wealthier landowners with surplus to sell can, and often do, exploit the situation, charging exorbitant prices that are far beyond your reach. The small coin you might have hoarded for an emergency is suddenly worthless in the face of such inflated costs. The concept of a just price, though sometimes espoused by the Church, often vanishes in the harsh reality of widespread scarcity. As hunger deepens, your already weakened body becomes even more susceptible to disease. The malnutrition that was a chronic undercurrent now becomes acute, accelerating the wasting process. Scurvy, pellagra, and other deficiency diseases become rampant. Your weakened immune system offers little resistance to infections. Diseases that might have been manageable in better times now become fatal epidemics, sweeping through the starving population. Diarrhea and dysentery, exacerbated by contaminated water sources as people become less discriminate in their desperation, can kill swiftly, especially the very young and the elderly. The social fabric of your village, already strained by hardship, begins to unravel. Trust erodes as desperation mounts. Theft, not just of food, but of anything that might be traded for it, becomes more common. Families turn inwards, fiercely guarding what little they have. Neighbourly support, once a cornerstone of village life, can give way to suspicion and hostility. Sometimes, in the depths of despair, horrific choices are made. There are dark whispers, and sometimes recorded instances, of people abandoning elderly relatives, or even, in the most extreme and nightmarish famines, resorting to cannibalism. Though this was rare and universally reviled, you might be forced to make heartbreaking decisions, selling your only meagre possessions, a cooking pot, your worn cloak, the few tools you own, for a handful of grain, perhaps even selling a child into servitude, a desperate act to ensure their survival, or the survival of the rest of the family, is contemplated, though the emotional toll of such a choice is unimaginable. If you own any livestock, a scrawny pig, a few chickens, they will be slaughtered early, providing a temporary reprieve, but eliminating a future source of food, milk, or eggs, and leaving you with nothing to breed from if you survive. A single failed harvest also means no seed for the following year's planting. This is perhaps one of the cruelest twists. Even if you somehow endure the months of starvation, you face the prospect of another year of hunger because you consumed your seed corn in a desperate attempt to stay alive. This can create a multi-year cycle of famine, each bad year compounding the last, making recovery incredibly difficult. The Lord might, in some cases, provide seed grain on loan, but this comes with further obligations, deepening your cycle of debt and dependency. There is no government relief program, no international aid agency to step in. Your community is largely on its own, reliant on the whims of nature and the charity, if any, of the local lord or monastery. Often, their resources are also strained, or their charity is selective. A single failed harvest exposes the utter fragility of your existence. It's a stark reminder that you live on a knife edge, where one bad season, one unlucky roll of the dice with the weather, can mean the difference between life and a slow, agonizing death by starvation and disease for you and everyone you hold dear. This lack of any buffer, any resilience in the system for the common peasant, is what made each harvest a terrifying, high-stakes gamble. Beyond the capricious tyranny of nature and the unyielding demands of your social superiors, another horseman of the apocalypse frequently thundered across the medieval landscape, its passage marked by devastation and a swift, brutal acceleration of hunger, war. Whether it was a grand conflict between kings and nobles, a localized feud between rival lords, or the opportunistic raiding of mercenaries and bandits, the arrival of soldiers in your vicinity almost invariably spelled disaster for you, the peasant whose life and livelihood were directly in their path. War possessed a hungry maw, consuming not just lives in battle, but the very sustenance needed to support those lives, leaving behind a trail of scorched earth, empty granaries, and profound, widespread starvation. Imagine your village, peaceful in its poverty, suddenly caught in the crossfire of a conflict you neither started nor understood. The first sign might be distant smoke on the horizon, or the panicked flight of refugees from a neighbouring settlement, their faces etched with terror, their meagre belongings bundled on their backs. Soon the soldiers arrive, perhaps the king's men, perhaps the forces of a rebellious baron, or even foreign invaders. To you, their allegiances often matter little. Their impact is tragically similar. Armies, in the medieval period, did not have complex, organised supply chains stretching back to vast logistical bases. They lived off the land. This meant that as they marched, they requisitioned, a euphemism for taking by force, whatever they needed from the countryside they passed through. Your carefully hoarded grain, the few scrawny chickens you owned, your single milk cow or plough ox, all were fair game. Resistance was met with violence. They would burst into your small hut, ransack your meagre stores, and take what they wanted, often leaving you with nothing. Your protests, your pleas for your family's survival, would be met with indifference, a sneer, or the flat of a sword. Fields, especially those nearing harvest, were prime targets. Soldiers would trample ripe crops, set fire to standing grain to deny it to the enemy, or simply out of malicious destruction, or systematically harvest it for their own encampments. Fruit trees would be stripped, vegetable gardens plundered. What they couldn't carry, they would often destroy to prevent it from falling into enemy hands or being used by the local population who might be suspected of supporting the other side. You would watch, helpless and horrified, as months of your back-breaking labour went up in flames or were carted away by armed men. Livestock were particularly vulnerable. Oxen needed for ploughing, cows for milk, pigs and sheep for meat, all were driven off to feed the troops. This not only meant an immediate loss of food, but also crippled your ability to farm in the future. Without your plough animal, how would you prepare the fields for the next planting, even if you had seed? The loss of a milk cow meant your children were deprived of a vital source of protein and calcium. If your village happened to be in a strategic location, it might be deliberately fortified by one side or besieged by the other. A siege was a slow, agonizing descent into starvation for the inhabitants trapped within. As supplies dwindled, the noose of hunger tightened. Any animals would be slaughtered first, then pets, then rats and mice. People would resort to boiling leather, grinding bones, and eventually the horrifying desperation of famine foods previously described, but in an even more concentrated and inescapable environment. Those outside the besieged area didn't fare much better if an army was camped nearby, as the surrounding countryside would be systematically stripped bare for miles around to sustain the besieging force. Even if your village was not directly on the path of an army, the disruption caused by war had far-reaching consequences. Markets would be disrupted, trade routes cut off. It would become impossible to travel safely to nearby towns to sell any small surplus you might have, a rare occurrence, or to buy essential goods. Fear would permeate the countryside, making it dangerous to even work in the fields if marauding bands of soldiers or deserters, known as routiers or écorcheurs, skinners, were known to be in the area. These groups, often unpaid or poorly disciplined, were little more than bandits, preying on the civilian population, stealing, raping, and murdering with impunity. The mere rumour of their approach could empty a village, forcing you to abandon your home and fields, becoming a refugee with nothing but the clothes on your back. The deliberate policy of chevauchée, a destructive cavalry raid, designed to undermine the enemy's economic resources and terrorise their population, was a common tactic. Knights and mounted men-at-arms would sweep through enemy territory, burning villages, mills and granaries, slaughtering livestock, and destroying vineyards and orchards. The aim was not just military, but economic and psychological devastation. You, the peasant, were the primary victim of this strategy. Your home, your livelihood, Your entire world could be annihilated in a matter of hours, leaving you with nothing but charred ruins and the bitter taste of ash and despair. War also diverted labour. Able-bodied men might be conscripted into the local levy or even pressed into service by force, taking them away from their farms during crucial planting or harvesting seasons. Their absence meant fewer hands to do the work, resulting in smaller yields and increased hardship for the families left behind. If they died in battle or from disease while on campaign, their families lost a vital breadwinner, often plunging them into inescapable poverty. The aftermath of conflict was often as bad as the conflict itself. Fields would lie fallow and overgrown, irrigation systems damaged, tools lost or broken, seed grain would be scarce or non-existent. It could take years, even generations, for a region to recover from the ravages of war. Disease often followed in the wake of armies, spreading rapidly among weakened, malnourished populations living in squalid, overcrowded conditions, whether as refugees or in war-torn villages. So, while you might fear the drought or the blight, the arrival of soldiers brought a different, more immediate and violent kind of threat to your food supply. It was a man-made famine, imposed with cold steel and burning torch. War turned your fields into battlegrounds, your storage huts into targets, and your life into a desperate scramble for survival in a landscape suddenly and brutally transformed by human conflict. The gnawing void in your stomach became deeper, more urgent, more terrifying, as the hungry maw of war consumed everything in its path. While you, the medieval peasant, primarily lived a life of subsistence, attempting to grow enough food to feed your own family and meet your obligations, you were not entirely isolated from the burgeoning market economy, especially as the Middle Ages progressed. In theory, markets could provide a place to sell a tiny surplus, a rare luxury, or, more critically in times of personal shortage, to buy grain. However, the reality of market forces often worked cruelly against you. The price of bread, your most basic staple, could fluctuate wildly, and in times of scarcity it would soar to levels far beyond your meagre means, driven by natural shortages, but also, insidiously, by human greed and speculation. Your inability to afford sustenance, even when it was physically present in the market stalls, was another brutal facet of food scarcity. Your interaction with the market was often one of desperation, not opportunity. You didn't typically have wagons laden with grain to sell for profit. More often, you might have a few eggs, a small cheese if your wife was skilled and you had a little milk to spare, or perhaps some foraged berries or nuts, hoping to trade for a bit of salt, iron for a tool, or, critically, grain if your own harvest had failed or run out. But when your own supplies were exhausted, it was usually because there was a wider regional shortage. And that's when the market became a cruel torment. When a harvest was poor across a district, the law of supply and demand, as ancient as humanity itself, kicked in with ruthless efficiency. The limited amount of grain available immediately became more valuable. Merchants, larger landowners with significant surpluses stored in their great barns, or even prosperous urban dealers who had bought grain cheap in times of plenty, saw an opportunity. They could hoard their stocks, releasing them only in small quantities, or transporting them to areas where the dearth was greatest and prices highest. This practice, known as engrossing, buying up large quantities to control the market, or forestalling, intercepting goods before they reached the open market to buy them cheap and sell dear, was widely condemned as morally reprehensible and was often illegal, but it was fiendishly difficult to control and persistently practiced. You would trudge to the local market town, perhaps miles from your village, your stomach hollow, clutching a few pathetic coins or a meagre item for barter. You arrive to find the grain merchants, their stalls piled high with sacks of wheat, barley or rye, food that could save your family. But the price chalked on the board, or shouted by the merchant's apprentice, is a figure that makes your heart sink. It might be double, triple, or even 10 times what it was after a good harvest. The small amount of money you possess, which might have bought a reasonable measure of grain in better times, now buys only a pitiful handful, not enough to feed a child for a day, let alone your whole family for a week. You watch as wealthier townsfolk, a successful artisan perhaps, or a minor official, count out their coins and walk away with sacks of flour. Their ability to pay highlights your own powerlessness. You might try to haggle to plead your family's desperate situation, but the merchant, hardened by commerce or simply overwhelmed by demand, is often unmoved. There are plenty of others willing, or desperate enough, to pay his price. He has no incentive to sell to you for less. The injustice of it is a bitter pill to swallow. Food is there, visible, tangible, yet it is as inaccessible as if it were on the moon. This isn't a famine caused by an absolute absence of food in the region, but an access famine, where the food exists but is priced out of reach for the poorest segments of society, and that, overwhelmingly, is you. The gnawing hunger your family endures is made worse by the knowledge that food is available nearby, but only for those with silver. The authorities, be it the town council, the local lord, or even the crown, might occasionally attempt to intervene by setting assize prices for bread and grain, trying to cap the maximum cost. Bakers might be required to produce a standard loaf of a specific weight and price. However, these regulations were often difficult to enforce. Millers and bakers might adulterate flour with cheaper, less nutritious fillers like bean meal, sawdust, or even chalk to maintain their profit margins when grain prices were high. The short weight loaf, looking the right size but being deceptively light, was a common complaint. Enforcement was patchy, and corruption among officials tasked with oversight was not unknown. Even if you managed to acquire a small amount of overpriced grain, you then faced the cost of milling it, as the lord's mill and the miller's share would still apply. Then, if you didn't have your own oven, or were forbidden to use one, the fee for the communal bakery. Each step added to the cost, further diminishing the tiny amount of actual food you ended up with. The desperation of being unable to afford bread could drive people to extreme measures. Food riots, though dangerous and often brutally suppressed, were not unheard of, where starving crowds might attack granaries, bakeries, or the homes of suspected hoarders. Theft of food became a matter of survival, not inherent criminality, though the punishments, flogging, branding, even hanging for repeat offences, were severe. You might face the agonizing choice of watching your children starve or risking your life and liberty to steal a loaf of bread. This market-driven starvation also deepened social divisions. The resentment between the starving rural poor and the sometimes better-off urban populations or wealthy landowners grew. The peasant, who toiled to produce the raw agricultural wealth, was often the first and most severely affected by high prices. Unable to afford the very product of his or his peers' labour once it entered the complex and often rigged channels of the market. So, while the image of a medieval peasant often conjures a life tied solely to the land they worked, the reality was more complex and, in times of scarcity, more brutal. The market, which could have been a lifeline, frequently became another instrument of their suffering. The abstract forces of supply, demand, and human greed translated into a very real and tangible emptiness in your belly. The price of bread, a stark and constant reminder of your precarious position at the very bottom of the economic ladder, where even visible food was often tragically out of reach. The relentless pressure of hunger, exacerbated by failed harvests, war, or crushing market prices, doesn't just decimate bodies, it frays the very fabric of society. As your reserves vanish, and famine foods become the norm, the established social order and the bonds of community that normally sustain village life begin to erode under the weight of widespread desperation. What was once a relatively cohesive, if hierarchical, group of families facing shared hardships can fragment into a collection of individuals and desperate households, each fighting for their own survival, sometimes at the expense of others. Begging, theft, and a general breakdown of social norms become increasingly common, painting a grim picture of a society pushed to its breaking point. In the early stages of a deepening food crisis, traditional forms of mutual support within the village might still function. Families might share what little they have, especially with kin or close neighbours. The elderly, or infirm, who always relied on the community's goodwill, might receive a little extra help. But as the scarcity becomes prolonged and severe, affecting everyone, the well of communal charity inevitably runs dry. When your own children are crying from hunger, their bellies distended, their limbs rail thin, the instinct for self-preservation and the preservation of your immediate family often becomes overwhelmingly powerful. The surplus you might have shared in better times simply no longer exists. You might find yourself, for the first time in your life, reduced to begging. This is a profound humiliation for a peasant who prides themselves on their ability to work the land and provide for their family. To knock on the door of a slightly better off neighbour, or to stand at the church door with an outstretched hand, hoping for a crust of bread or a spoonful of pottage, is a deeply shameful experience. The rejection, often born not of malice but of the other person's own diminishing stores, is a further blow to your dignity. You see others in the same position, their faces hollowed by hunger and despair, and the sight reinforces your own misery. Some peasants might leave their villages entirely, taking to the roads in a desperate search for alms, or work in towns or other regions rumoured to be less affected, though such rumours often prove false, and they would simply join the swelling ranks of wandering beggars. When begging yields little or nothing, theft becomes an increasingly tempting, or necessary, recourse. This often starts small, pilfering vegetables from a neighbour's meagre garden plot under the cover of darkness, or snatching a chicken if an opportunity arises. But as desperation deepens, so does the scale of the theft. Grain might be stolen from fields before it's fully harvested, or from poorly guarded storage huts. Poaching on the Lord's lands, snaring a rabbit, catching a fish in his stream, becomes a risk worth taking, despite the severe penalties if caught, which could range from heavy fines to mutilation, like the loss of a hand for persistent poaching, or even death. The forest, normally a place of strict manorial control, becomes a contested space where starving peasants clash with the Lord's gamekeepers. The fear of theft pervades the community. People become more suspicious of their neighbours, of strangers, of anyone who might be eyeing their dwindling supplies. Huts are barricaded more securely, meagre possessions hidden more carefully. Accusations fly, sometimes unjustly, fueled by hunger and suspicion. Disputes over a stolen turnip or a few handfuls of grain can escalate into violence. The communal spirit that once defined village life, where tools were shared and tasks undertaken collectively, can shatter under the strain. The breakdown isn't just about crime against property, it's about the erosion of trust and moral boundaries. People who were once respected members of the community might be ostracised if they are perceived to be hoarding food, whether or not it's true. Desperate individuals might betray others to the authorities for a small reward, or to deflect suspicion from themselves. Stories, perhaps exaggerated by fear and hunger, might circulate about unspeakable acts, though it's crucial to separate rumour from documented reality. The very fact these stories existed speaks to the psychological terror of famine. The traditional authority figures, the village elders, the reeve, even the priest, might find their influence waning. If they cannot provide relief or maintain order, their legitimacy is questioned. The lord of the manor, often an absent figure whose primary interaction with you is through his demands for rent and labour, might be seen not as a protector but as a distant oppressor, contributing to your plight through his exactions. His granaries, often full while his tenants starve, become potent symbols of injustice. Even family bonds can be strained to breaking point. There are documented, albeit extreme, cases from severe famines where parents abandon children they could no longer feed, or where the elderly, seeing themselves as a burden, might wander off to die alone, hoping to leave a little more for the younger generation. The natural order of care and protection can be tragically inverted when survival itself is at stake for everyone. While strong family loyalty often endured, the sheer pressure could lead to heartbreaking choices. Vagrants and bands of desperate people, driven from their own villages by hunger, might roam the countryside, sometimes resorting to violence to seize food. Your village might face threats not just from within, but from these desperate outsiders. Fear of strangers intensifies, and any traveller is viewed with suspicion rather than hospitality. This social breakdown is not a sudden collapse, but a gradual, painful unravelling. It is the sound of normal human decencies being silenced by the clamour of empty stomachs. It's the sight of children learning to steal before they learn to read, the suspicion in the eyes of lifelong neighbours, the lonely despair of those who can no longer rely on the support of their community. When food security vanishes, the invisible threads that bind people together, trust, cooperation, shared values, begin to snap one by one, leaving individuals and families isolated in their struggle against a common, overwhelming enemy: starvation. This erosion of community was one of the most brutal and disturbing consequences of prolonged food scarcity, leaving scars that could last for generations even after the immediate crisis had passed. In the brutal calculus of survival during times of severe food scarcity, it was almost invariably the weakest members of your peasant community who bore the heaviest burden and suffered the most catastrophic consequences. While hunger and malnutrition touched everyone, their impact was not evenly distributed. Your children, with their small developing bodies and higher nutritional needs relative to their size, and the elderly, whose strength was already waning and whose immune systems were often compromised, were disproportionately vulnerable. Watching them decline, knowing you were largely powerless to prevent it, was perhaps the most agonizing torment of all. For your children, the lack of adequate food was not just a matter of discomfort, it was a direct assault on their future, if they even had one. A child's body requires a constant, reliable supply of nutrients, proteins, calories, vitamins and minerals, for growth, for brain development, and for building a resilient immune system. When these are scarce, the consequences are swift and devastating. You would see your own offspring, once perhaps playful and energetic, become listless, their laughter silenced, their movements slow and weak. Their tiny limbs, which should have been chubby with youthful vigour, would become stick-thin, their skin papery and loose over protruding bones. The distended bellies of kwashiorkor, a grotesque symptom of severe protein deficiency, were a common and heartbreaking sight in starving children, making them look deceptively full, while their bodies wasted away. Their hair might lose its colour, becoming sparse and brittle. Rickets could leave their young bones soft and pliable, leading to bowed legs or other skeletal deformities if they survived long enough for these to become apparent. Their cognitive development, too, was impaired. A malnourished child struggled to learn, to concentrate, to engage with the world around them. The spark in their eyes would dim, replaced by a hollow, vacant look of perpetual hunger and confusion. More immediately dangerous was their extreme susceptibility to disease. Common childhood illnesses that a well-nourished child might easily overcome: measles, mumps, chickenpox, even a simple respiratory infection or a bout of diarrhea, became terrifyingly lethal for a child weakened by months of starvation. Their immune systems, starved of the building blocks needed to function, simply could not mount an effective defence. You would watch, helpless, as a fever took hold, as a cough worsened, as dehydration set in. The village would be filled with the sound of children's fretful cries, and the quiet, desperate prayers of their parents. Infant and child mortality rates, already shockingly high in the medieval period, even in the best of times, would skyrocket during famines, sometimes decimating an entire generation. Holding a dying child in your arms, their small body emaciated and cold, was an experience that would break even the strongest spirit. The elderly in your community faced their own unique set of vulnerabilities. Their bodies, already bearing the marks of a lifetime of hard labour and previous privations, had fewer reserves to draw upon. Their digestive systems might be less efficient at extracting nutrients from the meagre, coarse food available. Chronic ailments common in old age, stiff joints, failing eyesight, weakened hearts, would be exacerbated by malnutrition. They might lack the physical strength to forage for famine foods alongside younger, more able-bodied family members, or to compete for scarce resources. If they lived alone, having outlived their spouse or children, their situation was particularly perilous. Who would care for them? Who would share a precious morsel of food? In times of extreme scarcity, when families were struggling to keep their own children alive, the elderly could become overlooked, their needs pushed to the periphery. While respect for elders was a societal ideal, the brutal pragmatism of survival sometimes overrode it. There are accounts, as mentioned before, of the elderly sacrificing themselves by refusing food or wandering off, believing they were relieving their families of a burden. This was not always out of abandonment by the family, but sometimes a tragic, self-sacrificial act in the face of impossible choices. For both children and the elderly, the psychological impact of constant hunger and the surrounding despair was profound. Children, unable to fully comprehend the reasons for their suffering, might become fearful, withdrawn, or display behavioural problems. The elderly, witnessing the collapse of the world they knew and the suffering of their descendants, might sink into a deep depression, losing the will to live. Their accumulated wisdom, once a valuable asset to the community, might seem irrelevant in the face of such overwhelming primal need. The distribution of food within the family unit itself often became a source of agonizing moral dilemmas. Who should get the largest share of the pitifully small amount of food available? The able-bodied adults who needed strength to work and potentially procure more food? The children, whose futures were at stake? Or the elderly, who had earned a life of respect and care? There were no easy answers, and different families made different, heartbreaking choices. Often, the working adults would deprive themselves to give more to the children, but this, in turn, weakened their ability to provide in the long run. The sight of children begging, their faces pinched and eyes pleading, or the elderly lying listless and ignored in a corner of a hut, were potent symbols of societal breakdown. These were the individuals society, in its ideal form, was most meant to protect. Their disproportionate suffering during famines was a stark indictment of the system's inability to provide even the most basic security for its most vulnerable members. It highlighted the cruel reality that when the wolves of hunger were at the door, it was often the smallest and frailest sheep who were devoured first. Their quiet suffering a deeply disturbing testament to the true brutality of food scarcity. The spectre of famine was a constant companion throughout the Middle Ages, but its grim presence took on an even more terrifying significance in relation to the most catastrophic pandemic of the era, the Black Death. The relationship between famine and plague was a vicious, symbiotic dance of death. Years of chronic malnutrition and periodic, acute famines had already weakened the European population, making them more susceptible to the ravages of Yersinia pestis when it arrived in the mid-14th century. And in the plague's aftermath, the shattered agricultural landscape and demographic collapse created new waves of food scarcity, prolonging the suffering for those who had survived the initial onslaught. Famine, in essence, acted as both a precursor and an echo to the Black Death, compounding its horrors. Imagine the decades leading up to 1347. The population of Europe had been growing, putting increasing pressure on available agricultural land. More marginal, less fertile lands were brought under cultivation. While there were periods of relative stability, there were also significant widespread famines, most notably the Great Famine of 1000, 315 317, which had devastated large parts of northern Europe. Even outside these major crises, chronic undernourishment was the norm for you and your fellow peasants. Your diet, as we've explored, was often monotonous, lacking in essential vitamins and protein, leaving your immune system perpetually compromised. You were, in a word, pre-weakened. When the Black Death arrived, carried along trade routes by fleas on black rats, it encountered a population that was, in many areas, already teetering on the edge of ill health. A body struggling with long-term nutritional deficiencies simply does not have the same resources to fight off a virulent new pathogen as a well-nourished one. While the plague was terrifyingly lethal even to the healthy, it's highly probable that the widespread malnutrition increased susceptibility to infection and worsened the prognosis for those who did fall ill. Your immune response would be slower, weaker. Your body, lacking reserves, would succumb more quickly to the high fever, the agonizing buboes, the internal bleeding, and the organ failure that characterized the disease. The psychological impact of existing food insecurity also played a role. A population already beset by anxieties about where their next meal was coming from, already experiencing the loss of loved ones to starvation-related diseases, was perhaps less resilient in the face of this new, invisible, and utterly terrifying killer. Despair and fear, already present, were amplified to an almost unimaginable degree. During the plague itself, the mechanisms of food production and distribution completely collapsed. In terror-stricken villages, who would dare to work the fields when their neighbours were dying in droves? Who would bring the harvest in, mill the grain, or bake the bread when the risk of infection loomed over every interaction? Many peasants fled their villages, abandoning crops in the fields. Others, struck down by the plague, died before they could complete the agricultural tasks. The sick and dying needed care, but caregivers themselves often succumbed, further reducing the available workforce. The sheer number of deaths, estimated to be between 30 to 60% of Europe's population in just a few short years, created an acute labour shortage. Fields lay fallow, not because of drought or blight, but because there was no one left to tend them. Livestock wandered untended, dying of neglect, or falling prey to wolves. Granaries, if they contained anything, might remain untouched because everyone who knew of their contents was dead or too terrified to approach. The familiar structures of manorial obligation and village cooperation disintegrated in the face of overwhelming mortality. In this chaotic environment, even if food existed somewhere, getting it to those who needed it became almost impossible. Starvation stalked alongside plague, claiming those who might have otherwise survived the disease but had no means to feed themselves, or those who survived the disease only to find a world devoid of sustenance. In the immediate aftermath of the initial Black Death wave, and the recurrent outbreaks that followed for decades, the demographic landscape was permanently altered. This had complex and sometimes contradictory effects on food security. In some areas, the massive reduction in population meant that there was more land available per person for the survivors. The least fertile lands were abandoned, and agriculture could, in theory, concentrate on the better soils, potentially leading to higher per capita productivity. For some surviving peasants, this created opportunities. Labour was suddenly in high demand, and you, if you were a survivor, might find yourself in a stronger bargaining position, with lords desperate for tenants and workers. Wages for labourers rose in many places. However, this was not a universal panacea. The disruption was immense. The loss of skilled agricultural workers, ploughmen, shepherds, reapers, meant that specialised knowledge was lost. The complex systems of crop rotation and land management were often thrown into disarray. It took time for the agricultural economy to readjust. In the interim, localized food shortages and famines continued to occur, often exacerbated by the ongoing instability and recurrent, albeit smaller, plague outbreaks. Furthermore, the survivors, while perhaps having access to more land, were often traumatized and communities were shattered. The social capital, the trust, the networks of cooperation had been severely damaged. The psychological toll of having witnessed such widespread death could lead to a sense of fatalism or a live-for-the-moment attitude, not always conducive to the long-term planning required for successful agriculture. The shadow of the Black Death, therefore, loomed large over the issue of food scarcity for generations. It revealed, in the starkest possible terms, how a population weakened by hunger was more vulnerable to disease, and how a catastrophic epidemic could in turn utterly destroy the means of food production, leading to further starvation. It was a terrifying feedback loop. Even if you survived the plague itself, you then faced a world irrevocably changed, where the old certainties about food, labour, and community had been swept away, and the struggle for sustenance, while perhaps taking on new forms, remained a brutal and defining feature of your medieval peasant life. When your belly is chronically empty, when your children are wailing from hunger, and when every effort to secure food seems to be thwarted by forces beyond your control, it is a deeply human, though often tragic, response to seek explanations beyond the purely material. In the medieval world, where scientific understanding of agriculture, weather patterns, and economics was limited, and where a strong belief in the supernatural permeated every aspect of life, it was almost inevitable that famine and food scarcity would be attributed to unseen forces, divine displeasure, or the malevolent actions of scapegoats. This resort to superstition, while offering a semblance of understanding or a target for collective fear and anger, ultimately did nothing to alleviate the suffering, and often led to further injustice and brutality. Your worldview is one where God is an active agent in human affairs. Therefore, a prolonged drought, a devastating flood, a plague of locusts, or a mysterious crop blight is readily interpreted as a sign of divine anger. The local priest, in his sermons, might reinforce this belief, urging the community to repent for its sins, which are seen as the root cause of God's wrath manifested as famine. You and your fellow villagers might participate in penitential processions, flagellating yourselves, praying fervently, making offerings to saints, or undertaking special fasts, an ironic prescription in times of starvation, in an attempt to appease an angry deity. While these acts provided a communal outlet for anxiety and a framework for understanding suffering, they rarely, if ever, refilled empty granaries. Beyond divine judgment, there was a pervasive belief in the power of magic, both benevolent and malevolent. If crops failed consistently in one part of a field, or if milk curdled inexplicably, or if livestock fell sick and died without apparent cause, suspicion could easily fall upon someone in the community believed to be practicing witchcraft or sorcery. An old woman living alone, perhaps with a knowledge of herbs that set her apart, or someone with an unusual birthmark, or simply an individual who was unpopular or considered an outsider, could become the focus of communal fear. It was believed that witches could blight crops with a curse, summon storms to destroy harvests, or make cattle barren through malevolent spells. In times of severe food scarcity, when desperation was high and a tangible explanation was desperately sought, these suspicions could escalate rapidly. Accusations of witchcraft related to food production were not uncommon. People might claim to have seen the accused muttering incantations over fields, or collecting dew for nefarious purposes, or stealing the fertility of a neighbour's land or livestock. Once an accusation was made, especially if it was endorsed by local authorities or whipped up by a zealous preacher, it could lead to a witch trial. These trials were often characterized by coerced confessions, flimsy evidence, and a foregone conclusion of guilt, especially if the community was convinced that they had found the source of their suffering. The punishment for witchcraft, particularly if it was deemed to have caused harm or death, was often execution, usually by burning or hanging. While you might feel a temporary sense of relief that the cause of the famine had been removed, the underlying problems of poor soil, bad weather, or oppressive feudal obligations remained untouched. Minority groups within society also frequently became scapegoats during times of famine, often intertwined with accusations of ritualistic harm or economic sabotage. Jewish communities, for example, living apart and often engaged in money lending, one of the few professions open to them, were sometimes accused of deliberately causing famines by hoarding grain, poisoning wells, a common accusation during the Black Death, but also surfacing during food shortages, or even using magic to destroy Christian crops. These accusations, fueled by existing religious prejudice and economic resentment, could lead to violent pogroms, where Jewish quarters were attacked, property looted, and people massacred. The stolen goods might provide a brief, illicit alleviation of hunger for the rioters, but the underlying causes of the famine were, of course, entirely unrelated to the persecuted community. Even within the Christian majority, outsiders could be blamed. Heretical groups, if any existed in your region, might be accused of bringing God's wrath upon the entire community through their unorthodox beliefs. Strangers, vagrants, or itinerant labourers, already viewed with suspicion, could easily be blamed for thefts of food or for bringing bad luck to a village. The fear of the other intensified when resources were scarce, and projecting blame onto an identifiable, vulnerable group was a way to create a false sense of control or unity amongst the true community. This reliance on superstitious explanations and the scapegoating of individuals or groups served several psychological functions for you and your contemporaries. It provided simple answers to complex and terrifying problems. It offered a tangible focus for fear and anger, which might otherwise be directed at the more powerful but unassailable figures of the Lord or even God. By identifying and punishing a supposed wrongdoer, the community could feel it was taking action, restoring cosmic order, and perhaps averting future disasters. However, this was a delusion. The tragic reality was that these beliefs often compounded suffering. Innocent people were persecuted and killed. Social divisions were deepened. Valuable time and energy were diverted into rituals or witch hunts, instead of focusing on practical, albeit limited, solutions like improving food storage, diversifying crops where possible, or appealing for aid from less affected areas. The belief that your empty belly was caused by a neighbour's curse or divine retribution prevented a clearer understanding of the systemic issues, the weather, the limitations of your agricultural technology, the oppressive economic structures that truly underpinned your constant struggle with food scarcity. This misdirection of blame was one of the cruelest aspects of your intellectual and spiritual environment, a darkness that added another layer of fear and injustice to the already brutal reality of hunger. The brutal realities of food scarcity in your medieval peasant life inflicted far more than just physical hardship. They waged a relentless war on your mind. The constant, gnawing hunger, the sight of your family weakening, the ever-present threat of a failed harvest or a devastating raid, these were not just events to be endured, but sources of profound psychological torment. This torment manifested as a pervasive anxiety that shadowed your every waking moment, a creeping hopelessness that threatened to extinguish any spark of joy, and a visceral, primal fear of starvation that became deeply ingrained in your psyche, shaping your worldview and your emotional landscape in ways that are difficult for us to fully comprehend today. Imagine your daily life, a continuous tightrope walk over the chasm of starvation. Every decision, every observation, is filtered through the lens of food security. Will this rain shower be enough for the crops? Or will it turn into a deluge that rots the seeds? Are those clouds on the horizon a sign of a coming storm that could flatten the barley? Is that cough your child has the beginning of a deadly illness that their malnourished body cannot fight? This constant, low-level and often high-level vigilance creates an unceasing undercurrent of anxiety. There is no true peace of mind, no moment when you can simply relax and trust that things will be okay. The stakes are too high. A misjudgment, a bit of bad luck, can mean the difference between having something to eat and facing empty pots for weeks on end. This anxiety is not just about the present, but also a deep-seated fear of the future. The changing seasons, which should be a natural and predictable cycle, become sources of apprehension. Will the winter stores last? Will the spring planting be successful? Will the summer bring enough sun and rain in the right balance? You live in a state of perpetual uncertainty, unable to plan with any real confidence beyond the immediate needs of today or tomorrow. This chronic uncertainty eats away at your sense of agency, making you feel like a pawn at the mercy of unpredictable forces. The weather, the Lord, disease. As periods of food scarcity drag on, or when a true famine strikes, this anxiety can morph into a profound sense of hopelessness. When, despite all your hardest efforts, toiling from dawn till dusk, carefully rationing every morsel, praying with all your might, you still see your children's faces gaunt with hunger and feel the weakness spreading through your own limbs. It is easy to succumb to despair. What is the point of struggling if suffering is inevitable? The joy that might come from small things, a child's laugh, a sunny day, a village festival in better times, becomes muted, overshadowed by the ever-present reality of deprivation. Laughter becomes a rare commodity, and smiles are fleeting. The world can seem a bleak and unforgiving place, offering little solace or promise of improvement. The fear of starvation itself is a primal, visceral terror. It's not just the fear of physical discomfort, but the fear of a slow, agonizing death, of watching your loved ones waste away before your eyes. This fear can become all-consuming, driving desperate behaviours. It can make you suspicious of your neighbours, as we've discussed, fearing they might steal your meagre supplies. It can lead to nightmares, to obsessive thoughts about food, to an inability to think about much else. The sight of someone well-fed, like the Lord's reeve or a wealthy merchant, can evoke not just envy, but a deep, bitter resentment, highlighting the profound injustice of a world where some feast while others starve. This psychological burden also impacts your social interactions and your perception of community. While hardship can sometimes bring people together, chronic and extreme scarcity, as we've seen, often strains relationships to the breaking point. The constant stress and irritability fueled by hunger can lead to more frequent arguments within families and between neighbours. The sense of shared suffering might not always translate into mutual support when everyone is equally desperate. You might become more withdrawn, more insular, focused solely on the survival of your own household, even if it means turning a blind eye to the suffering of others. This is not necessarily a sign of inherent selfishness, but a tragic consequence of being pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. For children growing up in such an environment, the psychological scars can be deep and lasting. To experience chronic hunger, to witness such widespread suffering and death at a young age, can shape their entire worldview. They might develop a deep-seated insecurity, a distrust of the world, or a pervasive sadness that carries into adulthood, assuming they survive. The absence of a carefree childhood, the constant exposure to adult anxieties and hardships, robs them of the innocence and playfulness that should be their right. Furthermore, the remedies sought for this psychological distress were often rooted in the superstitious beliefs of the time. While communal religious rituals might offer some temporary solace or a shared sense of purpose, they did little to address the underlying trauma. When prayer and penance failed to bring relief from famine, it could lead to a crisis of faith for some, or a doubling down on more extreme forms of religious observance or scapegoating for others. The mental landscape of a medieval peasant grappling with food scarcity was thus a dark and fraught place. It was characterized not by the romanticized simplicity often portrayed in popular culture, but by a heavy weight of constant worry, a gnawing fear that permeated every aspect of existence, and a hopelessness that could be as debilitating as any physical ailment. This unceasing psychological torment, this internal suffering, was one of the most brutal and least visible aspects of why life sucked so profoundly when food was scarce. It was a wound to the soul, passed down through generations who knew, intimately, the terrifying fragility of life on the edge of starvation. In your life as a medieval peasant, often filled with hardship and submission, there existed a threshold, when the persistent torment of hunger, coupled with the merciless exploitation of feudal lords, and the seemingly indifferent neglect, or even blatant oppression by those in power, reached an unbearable culmination. The deep-seated desperation, long suppressed within you, would sometimes shatter generations of ingrained endurance and erupt into open revolt. These peasant uprisings, though often scattered like sparks, and almost invariably met with brutal suppression, stood as monuments built of blood and tears, decrying the profound suffering caused by food scarcity and systemic injustice. They were the desperate cries of those who felt they had nothing left to lose, pushed to the very brink, and what they provoked was an equally, if not more, savage response from the ruling classes, determined to maintain their power and order. You must understand that open revolt was usually a last resort, born of utter desperation. For generations, you and your forebears had been conditioned to accept your lot in life, to obey your lord, to pay your dues, and to trust in the divine order. The risks of rebellion were immense. Almost certain death, torture, the destruction of your village, and savage reprisals against your family and community. Therefore, the conditions had to be truly catastrophic, the sense of injustice utterly overwhelming, for you and your fellows to contemplate such a radical and perilous course of action. Severe and prolonged famine, often coupled with new, excessive taxation, perhaps to fund a distant war that brought you no benefit, or particularly egregious abuses by local lords or their officials, could be the spark that lit the tinderbox of peasant resentment. Once a revolt erupted, it was often characterized by a raw, explosive fury. Years, even centuries, of pent-up anger and frustration would boil over. Peasants, armed with their agricultural tools, pitchforks, scythes, axes, billhooks, and driven by a desperate courage, might attack the symbols of their oppression. Manor houses, the luxurious abodes of your lords, could be burned to the ground, their fine furnishings looted or destroyed. Granaries, symbols of hoarded wealth, while the people starved, would be prime targets, their contents seized and distributed amongst the hungry rebels. Debt records, detailing the endless obligations owed to the lord, would be sought out and triumphantly burned, a symbolic act of wiping the slate clean and hoping for a new beginning. The lord's officials, the reeve, the bailiff, the tax collectors, who were the most visible and immediate instruments of your oppression, often became the first targets of violence. They might be hunted down, subjected to mock trials, and executed, sometimes with a savagery that mirrored the brutality they themselves had inflicted. While the primary grievances were often economic, a demand for an end to serfdom, fairer rents, access to common lands, or simply food, there was also a powerful desire for retribution, an urge to violently overturn, however temporarily, the established social hierarchy. The leaders of these peasant revolts often articulated demands that were surprisingly specific and, from their perspective, reasonable. They might call for an end to serfdom and forced labour, fairer rents and taxes, the abolition of unjust laws or corrupt officials, access to common lands, or, most fundamentally, relief from hunger. They weren't necessarily seeking to dismantle the entire kingdom, but to achieve a more tolerable existence, an idealized moral economy, where their basic right to sustenance was respected. Figures like John Bull in England during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, with his radical question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" tapped into a deep well of resentment against the perceived injustices of the social order. However, your chances of success in such an uprising were vanishingly small. You were an undisciplined, poorly armed, and often disorganized force, driven more by rage and hunger than by military strategy. Arrayed against you was the full might of the feudal military system. Knights and men-at-arms, clad in steel armour, mounted on war horses, and trained from birth in the arts of combat, were a terrifyingly effective fighting force. Though they might initially be caught off guard by the scale and ferocity of a peasant uprising, the nobility would quickly rally to defend their interests and their very way of life, which they saw as divinely ordained. The repression that followed a peasant revolt was invariably swift, brutal, and utterly merciless. Once the peasant armies were defeated in open battle, a common outcome given their military disadvantages, or once the initial wave of the uprising subsided, the lords would exact a terrible revenge. Captured rebels were rarely shown mercy. Mass executions were commonplace. Hangings, beheadings, drawing and quartering, burning alive. Leaders were often singled out for particularly gruesome public executions, designed to serve as a terrifying warning to any others who might contemplate rebellion. There are accounts of gibbet cages lining the roads for miles, displaying the decaying corpses of executed peasants. Entire villages suspected of supporting the revolt could be razed to the ground, their inhabitants massacred or scattered. Collective punishments, such as massive fines levied on communities or the curtailment of any existing rights and privileges, were common. The aim was not just to restore order, but to crush the spirit of resistance, to reassert the absolute authority of the ruling class, and to ensure that such an upending of the social hierarchy would never happen again. Any concessions that might have been granted under duress during the height of the revolt were almost always revoked once the immediate threat had passed. You would witness firsthand, or hear terrifying accounts of the consequences of rebellion. The brief dream of a better life would be extinguished in blood and fire. The suffering that drove the revolt would now be compounded by the violence of its suppression. Families would lose their fathers, sons, and husbands, not to starvation this time, but to the executioner's axe or the soldier's sword. The fear of reprisal would hang heavy over your community for years, making even quiet dissent dangerous. The failure of these revolts, and the savage repression they provoked, reinforced a sense of hopelessness for many peasants. It seemed that there was no escape from their lot, no way to effectively challenge the powers that controlled their lives, and, by extension, their access to food. The system, designed to extract the maximum from your labour while offering minimal protection when you and your family teetered on the brink of starvation, appeared unshakable. The violent consequences of revolt served as a bloody confirmation of this grim reality. Thus, to your legacy of hunger, fear, and toil was added the harrowing memory of failed rebellion and its brutal cost, making submission and endurance, in most circumstances, appear to be the only strategy that allowed you to live on, however humbly. The story of food scarcity in your medieval peasant life doesn't conclude neatly with the end of a single bad harvest, or even a specific famine. Instead, it casts a long dark shadow over generations, leaving an enduring legacy of suffering, insecurity, and ingrained behaviours that profoundly shaped the peasant experience long after the immediate crises had passed. The constant threat of hunger, the memories of starvation, and the structural vulnerabilities that made famine a recurring nightmare were not easily forgotten or overcome. This spectre of famine haunted the medieval peasantry, becoming an invisible but ever-present character in the drama of their daily lives and collective consciousness. Imagine surviving a major famine, a period where you've witnessed death endured unimaginable hunger, perhaps eaten things that fill you with shame in retrospect, and made heartbreaking choices. Such an experience leaves indelible scars, not just on your body, but on your psyche. You carry with you the memories of lost loved ones, the haunting images of starving children, the constant anxiety of those terrible months or years. This collective trauma becomes woven into the folklore, the stories, and the oral traditions of your village, passed down from parents to children. Tales of the Great Hunger, or the Bad Year, serve as cautionary reminders of how precarious life can be, reinforcing a deep-seated fear of scarcity. This fear often translated into specific behaviours around food. Even in times of relative plenty, there would be an ingrained tendency towards frugality, an almost obsessive concern with not wasting a single crumb of bread or a spoonful of pottage. You would instinctively try to store and preserve food, however meagre your surplus, knowing from bitter experience how quickly abundance could turn to dearth. New farming techniques, if they became available and accessible, might be adopted slowly and cautiously, as the risk of a failed experiment was too great to bear when survival was always on the line. There was often a preference for tried and true methods, however inefficient, over innovative but potentially risky ones. The physical consequences of chronic malnutrition and periodic famines also had long-term intergenerational effects. Children who survived severe malnutrition in their early years might suffer from stunted growth, weakened constitutions, and long-term health problems, making them less productive as adults and more susceptible to illness throughout their lives. This could, in turn, affect their ability to provide for their own children, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and vulnerability. The demographic impact of major famines and the subsequent plagues, which, as we've seen, were often linked, also took generations to recover from, altering family structures, labour availability, and land tenure patterns for decades. The relationship between you, the peasant, and the land itself was deeply coloured by this legacy of food insecurity. The earth was both your sole provider and a fickle, often cruel, taskmaster. Your religious beliefs, while offering solace, also reinforced a sense of dependence on divine providence for a good harvest, alongside a fear of divine retribution in the form of famine. Superstitions and rituals aimed at ensuring fertility and warding off bad luck would continue to be an important part of your agricultural practices, a reflection of the deep anxiety surrounding the food supply. The power structures that contributed to your food insecurity, the demands of the Lord and the Church, the inequalities of land distribution, the vulnerability to market forces, did not disappear overnight. While major events like the Black Death did eventually lead to some shifts in the labour market and a gradual erosion of serfdom in parts of Europe, these were slow, uneven processes. For many generations, you and your descendants would continue to live under systems that extracted a significant portion of your agricultural output, leaving you with little margin for safety. The fear of not being able to meet these obligations, and thus losing your land or facing punishment, remained a powerful driver of anxiety. This enduring legacy of suffering also shaped your peasant community's worldview. There might be a prevailing sense of fatalism, a belief that hardship was simply the natural order of things for people of your station. Joy might be found in small, fleeting moments, but a fundamental pessimism about the future, particularly regarding material security, could be deeply ingrained. There would be a strong emphasis on resilience, on the ability to endure hardship, because hardship was seen as an almost inevitable part of life. Furthermore, the memory of past famines could influence social and political stability. While large-scale revolts were rare and brutally suppressed, the underlying discontent and the potential for unrest remained as long as the fundamental conditions of food insecurity persisted. Lords and rulers were not entirely oblivious to the fact that a starving peasantry was a dangerous peasantry, though their responses were often more focused on maintaining order and ensuring their own revenues than on genuinely alleviating the root causes of peasant suffering. Even as the Middle Ages drew to a close and slowly transitioned into the early modern period, the spectre of famine did not vanish for the rural poor. New crops from the Americas, like the potato and maize, would eventually provide more food security in some regions, but their adoption was slow and uneven. Agricultural improvements were gradual. The fundamental vulnerabilities to weather, disease, and exploitative economic systems remained significant factors in the lives of European peasants for centuries more. Thus, the experience of food scarcity in the Middle Ages was not a series of isolated incidents, but a defining, continuous condition that left a profound and lasting imprint on the bodies, minds, and culture of the peasantry. It was an inherited burden, a haunting awareness passed from one generation to the next, that survival was a constant struggle, that hunger was never far away, and that the world, for all its moments of beauty or grace, could also be a place of profound and enduring suffering when the fields lay bare and the granaries were empty. This relentless, grinding struggle against the void is the silent, often overlooked backdrop to much of medieval history.